The document was not found in a safe or a high command bunker. It was recovered from the mud. It was 3 pages of cheap, thin paper, soaked in the metallic-scenting residue of dried blood, and folded into a tight, grime-crusted square. It had been tucked inside the tunic of a dead North Vietnamese Army NVA officer, a man who had fallen during the chaotic close-quarters fighting near Fire Support Base Corral in May 1968. When the American intelligence officer first peeled the pages apart, he expected the usual sweep of tactical data, a map of hidden rice caches, a list of village informants, or perhaps a radio frequency schedule. But as the translation began to take shape, the atmosphere in the humid command tent shifted from professional curiosity to a heavy, cold silence. The first directive on the page was underlined twice. It was not a suggestion. It was a fundamental shift in North Vietnamese military doctrine. When encountering mixed Allied forces, identify and eliminate Australian soldiers first. The intelligence officer read it again, certain that the nuances of the Vietnamese language had been mangled. He called in a second translator. The result was the same. The document was chillingly clinical. It stated that Australian units represented a disproportionate threat. It assigned them a priority target designation. Most shockingly, it commanded NVA regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas to engage and kill Australians, even if it meant temporarily ignoring larger, more heavily armed American units standing right next to them. The officer stepped out of the tent and looked across the perimeter. A young Australian lieutenant from 3RAR was standing by a stack of empty crates. The boy was maybe 22 years old, his frame lean and hardened by months of jungle rot. He weighed perhaps 160 pounds. His uniform was a patchwork of green mold and red clay, and he carried an air of exhausted, predatory calm. "You blokes do something we should know about?" the American asked, gesturing toward the blood-stained intelligence report. The Australian didn't even turn his head. He just adjusted the strap of his sawed-off L1A1 rifle, spat a dark glob of tobacco juice into the dust, and shrugged. Quote 4. Within 48 hours, that document was on a desk at MAC-V, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, in Saigon. Within a week, it was being analyzed at the Pentagon. The NVA weren't saying the Australians were braver. Bravery was common in the jungle. They were saying the Australians were more dangerous. The enemy had done the cold, hard mathematics of survival, and the results were an indictment of everything the Western military machine believed about how to win a war. By 1968, the American presence in Vietnam had evolved into what military historians call the doctrine of the typhoon. It was a war of industrial, technological, and logistical overwhelming. The Americans moved with the weight of an empire. When they entered an area, the jungle shook. Bulldozers carved massive orange clay scars into the canopy to build fire support bases. Thousands of tons of high explosives were dropped from the belly of B-52s. The Americans moved in company or battalion strength, preceded by the incessant, rhythmic thrum of Huey helicopters. The American strategy was find, fix, and destroy. They wanted to lure the enemy into a massive, decisive engagement where the superior weight of American metal, artillery, napalm, and airstrikes could win the day. The Australians, however, looked at this and saw a strategic dead end. The Australian task force, headquartered in Phuoc Tuy province, brought a different DNA to the conflict. They had spent the 1950s fighting communist insurgents in the steaming rainforests of Malaya and the dense, vertical scrub of Borneo. They had learned a fundamental truth that the Pentagon refused to accept. In the jungle, the side that is seen first is the side that dies. While the Americans fought a war of volume, the Australians fought a war of precision. They adopted the doctrine of the mosquito. A typhoon is loud and destructive, but you can see it coming from miles away, and you can hide in a bunker until it passes. A mosquito is silent. You don't know it's there until it has already bitten you. And if there are enough mosquitoes, they will drain you dry without ever giving you a target to hit back. To the Australians, quote, one was not a tactic. It was a biological state of being. Long before they were deployed to the quote 2 of Phuoc Tuy, recruits were put through a grueling training process designed to strip away their quote 3 habits. The NVA officer who wrote the captured directive noted a detail that haunted his soldiers. Quote, 4. This was not an accident. Australian patrol doctrine required quote, _5 _. Weeks before heading into the bush, soldiers were forbidden from using scented soaps, deodorants, or even flavored toothpaste. They allowed their skin to regain its natural oils, which eventually blended with the organic scents of the mud, the rotting vegetation, and the rain. They ate, quote, 6. While American units often relied on, quote, 7 that required heating, sending plumes of scented steam into the air, the Australians lived on dried beef, biscuits, and cold water. They carried no flavored tobacco and left no cigarette butts. They even practiced, quote, 8, training themselves to suppress coughs and sneezes by pressing their tongues against the roof of their mouths. But the most radical difference was their movement. The Americans moved like soldiers, heavy packs, clanking canteens, and the constant crackle of the PRC-77 radio. The Australians moved like predators. They didn't hack through vines with machetes, they slipped between the leaves. They felt the ground with their toes before committing their weight, avoiding dry twigs and crunchy leaves. In the triple canopy rainforest, where visibility is often less than 5 meters, the Australians relied on a scent and sound radar. They could detect the faint chemical aroma of ba moi ba beer, or the scent of a Viet Cong cooking fire from hundreds of meters away. They would find the enemy's heartbeat long before the enemy even knew the Australians had entered the province. The NVA's order to kill Australians first was born out of the terror of the L-shape ambush. This was the signature move of the Royal Australian Regiment, RAR, and it was executed with a mechanical, cold-blooded efficiency that the Viet Cong had no answer for. In a typical American engagement, contact would start with a sudden burst of fire, followed by a frantic retreat or a call for massive air support. The Australians didn't call for the sky to save them. They were the environment. An Australian 6-man section would locate an enemy supply trail and wait. They didn't wait for an hour, they would wait for days. They practiced static endurance, remaining completely motionless for up to 12 hours at a stretch. They wouldn't fire at the lead scout. They would watch him pass, often just feet away. They would let the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th men pass. They waited until the entire NVA column was bunched up in the center of the tooth. The geometry was absolute. At the apex of the tooth sat the M60 machine gunner. His field of fire ran the entire length of the trail. Along the short axis were the riflemen, their barrels overlapping to cover every possible inch of the kill zone. When the signal was given, it wasn't a firefight, it was a slaughter. The Australians didn't spray and pray. They fired in controlled rhythmic bursts. 3 rounds. Pause. 3 rounds. In 90 seconds, a veteran NVA platoon would be erased. There were no blind spots. There was no front line to charge. The fire came from the trees, from the earth, and from behind them. The NVA realized that against the Americans, you could survive by being aggressive. But against the Australians, aggression was suicide. If you gave an Australian section 10 seconds to set their geometry, you were already a statistic. The kill first directive was an admission of psychological defeat. In other parts of Vietnam, the Viet Cong felt safe in their sanctuaries. They had built elaborate tunnel networks and secret base camps where they could rest and plan. But in Phuoc Tuy, the dead zone, there were no safe places. The Australians didn't just kill soldiers, they dismantled the revolution's infrastructure. They would sit in the mud, covered in leeches, and simply watch for weeks. They documented the faces of the village tax collectors. They mapped the courier routes. They found the secret kitchens. Then, in a single night of coordinated silent strikes, They would remove the entire leadership of a district without firing a single artillery shell. The NVA felt like they were being fought by an invisible, omniscient mind. They began to believe the Australians were part of the jungle itself, ghosts who didn't need to eat, didn't need to sleep, and didn't know the meaning of fear. This was the context of the blood-stained document found at Coral. It was a cry of desperation from an enemy that was being outmaneuvered not by technology, but by a superior understanding of the hunt. While the Australian patrols were winning the war of shadows in the scrub, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, High Command, decided to test the Australians in a, quote, three-war, a conventional large-scale confrontation. In May 1968, they launched an offensive against Fire Support Base Coral and FSB Balmoral. They didn't send guerrillas. They sent 3 full regiments of the 7th NVA Division, 6,000 battle-hardened regulars equipped with heavy mortars, RPGs, and the fanatical resolve of human wave tactics. The NVA plan was simple: overwhelm the small Australian force with a 10-to-1 numerical advantage. They expected the Australians to break under the weight of a coordinated, multi-regimental assault. What followed was a 26-day odyssey of violence that remains a masterclass in defensive warfare. On the night of the first assault, the NVA charged out of the tree line, screaming and blowing whistles, expecting to find a panicked garrison. Instead, they hit a wall of cold steel discipline. Unlike American units that might call for mad-minute fire, spraying thousands of rounds into the dark, the Australians held their fire until the enemy was within 30 meters. Every bullet had a designated owner. The machine gunners didn't sweep their barrels. They fired in short 3-round bursts that cut through the charging ranks like a laser. The NVA regiments were slaughtered. They threw wave after wave of soldiers against the Australian perimeter, but they found no gaps, no dead ground, and no panic. The Australians moved through their trenches with a rhythmic, mechanical calm, clearing jams and reloading under fire as if they were on a training range. When the sun rose over the smoking craters of Coral, the NVA had lost hundreds of their best men. The Australians had lost only a handful. By the end of the month, the NVA had suffered over 3,000 casualties, confirmed and estimated. The Australians had lost 25. The reports reached the Pentagon and were met with stunned silence. It was a statistical anomaly that shouldn't have been possible. The Australians had less artillery, fewer helicopters, and no jet support during the height of the monsoon storms. They won because their baseline of _0_ was higher than the enemy's fanaticism. This was the moment the kill first directive was formalized. The NVA realized that if they couldn't crush the Australians with a 10-fold advantage in a conventional fight, they would have to hunt them individually, like predators. The captured document at Coral acted as a mirror for the American command, but it was a mirror they refused to look into. U.S. Army liaisons, such as Lieutenant Colonel Eric Smith, spent weeks embedded with Australian sections and came back transformed. He wrote a 40-page report to MACV headquarters in Saigon, arguing that the American, quote, 3, quote, was effectively helping the enemy survive. Quote, 4, quote, Smith wrote. Quote, 5, quote. Smith's report contained a radical suggestion. Dismantle the massive fire bases, strip the infantry of their heavy packs, and retrain every U.S. platoon in _6_. The response from the Pentagon was a cold, institutional wall. The American military-industrial complex was built on the consumption of resources. A war of silence and 6-man patrols didn't require millions of gallons of fuel or billions of rounds of ammunition. To adopt the Australian way would be to admit that the most expensive military machine in history was the wrong tool for the job. The report was classified as observation only and filed away in a drawer where it remained for decades. The Americans continued their search and destroy missions, generating massive noise and taking heavy casualties, while the Australians continued to dismantle the NVA's local infrastructure with the surgical precision of a scalpel. If the regular Australian infantry were the ghosts, the SASR, Special Air Service Regiment, were the nightmares. These men were the extreme evolution of the patrol doctrine. In late 1969, an SASR patrol led by Sergeant Bill Henderson was inserted into the Hat-Dick Forest, a place so thick and dangerous that even the NVA avoided moving through it at night. Henderson's team carried no radios and had no fallback plan. They moved through the bush at a pace of less than 200 meters per hour, feeling every leaf and branch. They found an NVA regimental headquarters. Instead of calling for a B-52 strike, which would have alerted the survivors, Henderson and his 4 men spent 18 days living inside the enemy's perimeter. They sat in the mud, covered in leeches and ants, and documented every officer's face, every radio code, and every supply schedule. They were so close they could hear the NVA officers arguing about their dinner. When they finally extracted, they didn't have a single body count to report. But the intelligence they brought back allowed the Australian task force to launch a series of, quote, 11 raids that neutralized the entire 274th NVA Regiment's leadership in a single night. The NVA were convinced that the Australians had developed some kind of secret technology, night vision goggles or thermal sensors. They couldn't believe that human beings could be that quiet. They didn't realize that the technology was simply a level of discipline that the NVA themselves had abandoned in favor of large unit maneuvers. As the war in Vietnam drew to its messy, politically charged conclusion in 1972, the Australians prepared to leave. They didn't leave behind rusted tanks or massive, abandoned cities of steel. They left behind a province, Phuoc Tuy, that was fundamentally broken for the revolution. It was the only province in South Vietnam where the local Viet Cong infrastructure had been almost entirely uprooted. The final irony of the _1_ directive is that it was never officially acknowledged by the Australian government at the time. The soldiers came home to a country that was divided and hostile toward the war. They didn't get parades, and they didn't get medals for being scary. But the enemy remembered. In the 1990s, after relations between the West and Vietnam normalized, retired NVA generals began to meet with their former rivals. During a meeting in Hanoi, a former NVA commander was asked about the different Allied forces he had fought. "The Americans were like a storm," he said through a translator. "You wait for the storm to pass, and then you rebuild. But the Australians were like a disease. You don't know you have it until you are dying. We spent more time looking for the 5 Australians in the woods than we did looking for the 500 Americans on the hill." The "shoot the Australians first" order remains the ultimate testament to what can be achieved when a small force chooses discipline over firepower and patience over speed. It proved that the most dangerous thing on a battlefield is not a machine, but a man who has learned to be silent. The document found at Coral is now a piece of history, its blood-stained pages preserved in an archive. But the lesson it teaches is immortal. In the world of the hunter, the loudest voice is the one that is silenced first. But the ones who move like ghosts, they are the ones who decide when the war is over.